speak, didn't cry, just stood there like something inside her had died. I learned later her name was Grace. Her parents had been killed in a car accident 2 weeks before. The old man was her grandfather, her only living family. I watched him kneel before her the same way he'd knelt before me, watched him offer his hand, patient and kind, asking nothing, offering everything. She took it, and I understood then that William Sullivan had a gift for healing broken things. For 10 years, I watched Grace grow from the shadows of the forest. She never spoke, not after that first day. The doctors called it selective mutism, a trauma response to losing her parents. But William understood what they didn't. Grace hadn't lost her voice. She'd simply decided that words were too painful, too connected to the last thing her mother said before the crash. "I love you, sweetheart." William never forced her to speak. Instead, he taught her a different language. The language of the forest, of animals, of silence that meant more than words ever could. He taught her to read tracks in the mud, to identify birds by their songs, to move through the woods like water through stones. And Grace learned to draw. How she drew every feeling she couldn't speak, she put on paper. I saw her drawing sometimes when I crept close to the cabin windows at dusk. Pictures of her parents, always smiling. Pictures of William, his kind eyes crinkled at the corners. Pictures of the forest, and sometimes pictures of me. She'd seen me. I realized this silent child had spotted the white wolf watching from the trees, and instead of fear, she'd felt something else. Connection, maybe. Recognition of another creature who didn't quite fit. William showed her the photographs he'd taken of me over the years, told her the story of how we'd met, how I'd chosen to stay near even after healing. Grace studied those photos for hours, tracing my white fur with her finger. She began leaving food out for me. Small pieces of meat on the porch, placed carefully on a wooden plate. I never took them at first. Trust was a luxury I couldn't afford, not after my pack, not after my mother. But Grace was patient, just like her grandfather. She never tried to approach me, never called out or made demands. She simply offered and waited and understood when I disappeared into the trees. 2 months before everything changed, William got sick. I smelled the cancer on him before any doctor diagnosed it. A wrongness in his scent, something rotting from the inside. He grew thinner, moved slower, coughed blood into handkerchiefs he thought Grace didn't see. But Grace saw everything. Her drawings became darker, more desperate. Pictures of William fading away, becoming transparent, disappearing, the night before he died. William sat on his porch and looked directly at the tree line where I hid. He couldn't see me in the darkness, but somehow he knew I was there. He always knew. "Take care of her," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's going to need someone who understands what it's like to be alone." I wanted to tell him I would. I wanted to promise, but I was a wolf, and wolves don't make promises to dying men. William Sullivan died in his sleep 2 nights later, Grace holding his hand. I watched from the forest as they took his body away, watched as Grace stood at his grave, silent tears streaming down her face, not making a sound. Watched as a sharp-faced woman arrived, introduced herself as Grace's Aunt Margaret, and began talking about selling the cabin, moving to Memphis, getting Grace proper care. Grace shook her head violently, but Margaret didn't understand, didn't want to understand. This 14-year-old girl who wouldn't speak, who lived in the woods like a wild thing, who just lost the only person who truly knew her. After the funeral, after the relatives left, Grace walked into the forest. She walked until she reached the clearing where William used to bring her, where he taught her to identify mushrooms and track deer. She sat down on a fallen log and pulled out her sketchbook. She drew for hours, drew William's face, his smile, his hands that had held hers through the worst moments of her life, drew the cabin, the forest, the mountains, drew her parents, faded now like old photographs, and then she drew me. The white wolf she'd never touched, never spoken to, but somehow knew was watching. When she finished, she held up the drawing toward the trees. "I know you're there," she whispered. Her voice was rusty, barely used, but it was there. "Grandpa told me that you remember kindness." I stayed hidden, but my ears were forward, listening. "I'm alone now," she continued, tears in her voice. "Just like you were, just like you are." As she set the drawing on the log and walked away, I waited until dark to approach. The drawing cure showed me standing on a ridge, moonlight making my white fur glow, eyes watching over the cabin below. It was beautiful and sad and true. At the bottom, in careful letters, she'd written, "Family isn't always blood." That was when I made my decision. William had saved me once. Now I would save what he'd loved most. I would protect Grace Sullivan, even if it cost me everything. I just didn't know how soon I'd have to prove it. Late April brought the sound of thunder to the mountains, but it wasn't a storm. I was denning in a cave 2 miles from Grace's cabin, heavy with pregnancy. My mate had been killed by hunters 6 months before, shot for sport and left to rot. The pups I carried were all I had left of him, and I was terrified they wouldn't survive. Stressed mothers often lose their litters, and I'd been stressed since William died. The sound came from above, a mechanical screaming that made every animal in the forest run for cover. I emerged from my cave to see a small plane trailing black smoke, spiraling through the sky like a dying bird. It clipped the tops of pine trees and crashed somewhere in the deep woods, the impact shaking the ground beneath my paws. Smoke rose in a dark column. I should have stayed away. Plane crashes meant humans, and humans meant danger. But something pulled me forward, some instinct I couldn't name. The wreckage was scattered across a 1/4 mile of forest. The cargo hold had split open, spilling crates across the ground. Most were broken, contents destroyed. But one crate had landed in the branches of an old oak, caught in the canopy like a gift from the sky. Inside, something was crying. I climbed. Wolves aren't natural climbers, but desperation makes you capable of impossible things. The crate had cracked on impact, and through the gap, I saw him, a lion cub, no more than 3 months old, golden fur matted with blood that wasn't his own. His mother's blood, I realized, smelling the adult lioness scent mixed with death and gunpowder. The cub saw me and mewled, a sound so pitiful it cut through every predatory instinct I possessed. He was an enemy. Technically, lion and wolf don't mix in nature, but he was also a baby, orphaned and alone, just like I'd been. Before I could decide what to do, an eagle dove from above, talons extended. The crate shifted, and the cub tumbled out, falling through branches toward the rocks below. I lunged, trying to catch him, but I was too far away. Grace caught him instead. She'd been walking in the forest, sketchbook under her arm, trying to feel close to William in the places he'd loved. The cub fell directly into her arms. An impossible coincidence that felt like fate. She stared at him, shocked. He stared back, golden eyes meeting hers. Then he pressed his face against her chest and cried, and I saw Grace's heart break open with love. She ran toward the cabin, clutching the cub like he was made of glass. I followed at a distance, watching from the trees. Grace burst through her front door and laid the cub on William's old armchair, checking him for injuries with surprising competence. William had taught her well. Within an hour, 2 wildlife officers arrived. I recognized one of them, Officer Janet Hayes, who'd worked with William for years. She was kind but firm as she explained the situation to Grace. The plane had been transporting exotic animals illegally. The cub's mother had been poached in Africa, and the cub sold to a circus in Kentucky. The plane crashed during a storm, and now they were trying to recover all the animals. Some were dead, some had escaped. This cub needed to be returned to legal custody or taken to a state facility. Grace's body language screamed refusal. She held the cub tighter, shaking her head violently. Officer Hayes softened. "Grace, I understand, but he's a lion. He'll grow up to be dangerous. You can't keep him." Grace grabbed a piece of paper and wrote in angry, desperate strokes. "He's an orphan, like me. He needs someone who understands." The other officer, a younger man named Tom Crawford, shifted uncomfortably. "The legal owner is Marcus Thornwood. He runs Thornwood Family Circus. He's already demanding the cub be returned." Grace's eyes went wide with fear. She wrote again, "Circus ex prison. Hayes, Detier, I know how you feel, but this is the law. You have 24 hours to think about it. If you know where the cub is, you need to tell us." After they left, Grace sat on the floor, crying silently, the cub asleep in her lap. I watched through the window, my own heart aching. This girl had lost so much already. How could the universe be cruel enough to take this from her, too? That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I had given birth to my pups 3 days earlier in the cave. 4 were born, but 3 were stillborn, their tiny bodies cold before they took their first breath. Only one survived, a female with fur as white as mine, small and fragile but fierce. I called her Shadow in my mind, though Grace would later name her Luna. I'd been planning to raise her alone, to teach her to survive in a world that didn't want white wolves. But watching Grace through that window, seeing her loneliness and desperate love, I realized something. William had saved me when I was dying. He'd given me back my life, asking nothing in return. I'd never repaid that debt. But his granddaughter needed saving now, needed it in a way that had nothing to do with physical survival and everything to do with the soul. At dusk, I picked up Shadow carefully in my mouth and walked toward the cabin. The door was unlocked. Grace, too distraught to remember basic security. I pushed it open with my nose and stepped inside. Grace was sitting at the kitchen table, the cub beside her, both of them looking lost. She looked up at my entrance and froze. We stared at each other across the small room. Her eyes widened as she recognized my white fur, remembered the drawings, the photographs, the stories William had told. I walked slowly forward and placed Shadow on the floor beside the lion cub. Then I sat, making myself as non-threatening as possible, and waited. Grace's hand trembled as she reached out, not toward me, but toward my pup. Shadow squeaked and crawled toward the warmth of the cub's golden fur. The cub, who was still groggy, instinctively curled around her. Then I did something that went against every wild instinct I possessed. I lay down beside them and began to nurse both babies, Wolf and Lion, together. Grace's sob was the sound of something breaking and healing at the same time. "Thank you," she whispered, her rusty voice barely audible. "Thank you for coming back." The first 2 weeks were the hardest. I wasn't domesticated, and every instinct screamed at me to return to the wild. The cabin walls felt like a cage. Even though the door remained open, Grace never locked it, never trapped me. She understood that I needed to know I could leave. But every time I considered running, I looked at Shadow, so small and vulnerable, and at the lion cub, who'd somehow become part of my responsibility. Grace had named him Courage, writing it carefully in her journal and showing me the letters as if I could read them. In a way, I could. I understood the meaning in her eyes, the way she said the word with reverence and hope. Courage and Shadow were inseparable from the start. They ate together, slept tangled in each other's fur, and played with the clumsy enthusiasm of babies who didn't know they were supposed to be enemies. Watching them reminded me that hatred isn't born, it's taught. Nature made us different, but it didn't make us enemies. Humans did that. Grace transformed in their presence. The haunted look faded from her eyes, replaced by something I hadn't seen since William died. Purpose. She woke early to prepare food, mixing formula for the babies with the careful precision William had taught her. She kept the cabin dark during the day, curtains drawn against prying eyes. At night, she read to us from William's old books, her voice growing stronger with each word. I learned her rhythms, her scents, her moods when she was sad. She smelled like rain when she was afraid, like copper and salt when she was content. Sitting with all of us piled around her, she smelled like home. I brought prey back to the cabin, leaving rabbits and squirrels on the porch. Grace understood this for what it was, contribution, partnership. She cleaned and cooked them, wasting nothing, honoring the lives taken. This was the way of wolves. And somehow, this human girl understood. But danger was never far away. Aunt Margaret returned on a gray Tuesday morning, bringing with her a man in an expensive suit. I was outside when they arrived, but I heard everything through the open window. "Grace, this is Richard Blackwell, a real estate agent," Margaret announced, her voice sharp with impatience. "We need to discuss the cabin." Grace said nothing, but I heard her pencil scratching frantically on paper. "Your silence isn't helping anyone," Margaret continued. "You're 14 years old. You can't live alone in the woods. It's not safe, it's not legal, and it's not healthy." More scratching, then Margaret's exasperated sigh. "This is my home," she read aloud from Grace's note. "Grace, your grandfather is dead. This cabin is falling apart. The market value is excellent right now. We could get enough to set you up properly in Memphis, get you into a good school, proper therapy." From my position, beneath the window, I heard Shadow whimper from the back bedroom where Grace had hidden the babies. My ears went flat. If they discovered the animals, everything would fall apart. What was that noise? Richard asked. Probably just the house settling, Margaret said quickly, but her voice carried doubt. Grace, I'm trying to help you. Your grandfather filled your head with nonsense about living wild and free, but that's not reality. You need structure, supervision, people around you. The pencil scratched again. I have what I need here, Margaret read, her voice rising. What you need is stability. Look at you. You won't even speak. The court is going to rule on your guardianship in a month, and if they think you're living in unsafe conditions, they'll remove you anyway. Is that what you want? I heard Grace's sharp intake of breath, smelled fear spike in the air. From the bedroom, Courage began to cry, the sound unmistakably feline. What the hell is that? Richard moved toward the bedroom door. I reacted without thinking. I threw myself against the front door, slamming it open with a bang that made both adults jump. I didn't enter, just showed myself in the doorway. White fur stark against the dark interior, lips pulled back to show teeth. Margaret screamed. Richard stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. Jesus Christ, Grace, there's a wolf! Grace rushed forward, putting herself between me and them, arms spread wide in protection, not protecting them from me. Protecting me from them? Grace, get away from that animal! Margaret shouted, but Grace stood firm. And I saw something in her stance. I recognized a mother protecting her young. In that moment, I understood that's what I'd become to her. Not a pet, not even just a friend, family. Margaret and Richard fled to their car. Margaret shouting threats about calling animal control, about proving Grace was unfit, about taking everything away. Grace stood in the doorway until they were gone, then collapsed against the frame, shaking. I approached carefully and pressed my head against her leg. She buried her fingers in my fur and cried without sound, her body heaving with sobs she wouldn't release as noise. That night, after the babies were asleep, Grace showed me her drawings. She'd been documenting everything, creating a visual diary of our strange family. There were pictures of me nursing both cubs, of Shadow and Courage playing, of quiet moments that felt almost normal. But there were also dark pictures, sketches of cages, of a man with cruel eyes, of Shadow and Courage being torn away. Grace's fears made visible. She pointed to the drawing of the cruel-eyed man. Marcus Thornwood, she wrote beneath it. Courage's owner, he's looking for him. Officer Hayes had returned the day before with news. Marcus was offering a $10,000 reward for information about the missing cub. He'd been posting flyers all over town, had hired a private investigator. It was only a matter of time before someone spotted something suspicious. Grace had started building a hiding place deep in the forest, converting an old mine shaft on the property's edge into an emergency shelter. She worked on it every afternoon while I stood guard, hauling in supplies, creating multiple escape routes. She was thinking like a wolf now, always planning for danger, always ready to run. But running had consequences. 3 days after Margaret's visit, Officer Hayes came alone at sunset. I smelled her approach and gathered the cubs, moving them to the mine shaft while Grace met Hayes at the door. "I'm not here officially," Hayes said quietly. "But Grace, you need to know. Marcus Thornwood is in town. He's giving a presentation at the community center tomorrow night about animal safety and recovering stolen property. He's building public pressure, making you look like a criminal. Grace wrote quickly, I saved Courage. He fell from the sky into my arms. How is that stealing? I know. I believe you. But Marcus has papers proving ownership. The law doesn't care about circumstances, only documentation. Hayes paused. There's something else. I did some research on Marcus. 12 years ago, his 5-year-old son was killed by a lion at his circus. Since then, his training methods have become extreme. Animals' rights groups have tried to shut him down multiple times, but he's always had enough political connections to survive. Grace's hand trembled as she wrote, He'll hurt Courage. I can't prove that legally, but between you and me, yes, I think he will. Hayes glanced toward the forest. I saw your wolf friend the other day. She had a pup with her, white like her mama. Grace froze. I didn't see anything. Hayes continued carefully. And I won't see anything. But you need to be smarter about this. People are watching. Mrs. Chen next door has been asking questions. Hunters are requesting permits for this area because they've seen unusual predator activity. You're running out of time. After Hayes left, Grace sat on the porch steps, and I laid my head in her lap. Shadow and Courage emerged from the forest, sensing the danger had passed, and climbed over both of us in a tangle of fur and paws. I don't know what to do, Grace whispered. I can't let him take Courage, but I can't lose the cabin either, and I can't put you in danger. I didn't have answers. I was a wolf, and wolves dealt with threats by fighting or running. But this was a human problem, tangled in human laws and human cruelty. The next evening, Grace and I went to the community center. She stayed hidden in the trees while I positioned myself near an open window, listening. Marcus Thornwood was a large man in his late 50s, with a face carved by grief and anger. Scars ran down his left cheek, old wounds from claws or teeth. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I'm here tonight because someone in this community is harboring my property, a lion cub, 3 months old, worth $30,000, stolen from the crash site before authorities could secure it. He clicked a remote, and an image appeared on the screen behind him. A golden lion cub, younger than Courage, but unmistakably the same bloodline. This animal is dangerous. It comes from a line of aggressive lions, including the one that killed my youngest son. His voice cracked. Real pain bleeding through the anger. Jeremy was 5 years old. He loved animals, loved the circus. One moment of carelessness, one unlocked cage, and he was gone, torn apart while I watched, unable to save him. The crowd murmured sympathetically. I saw people's faces soften, saw them begin to see Marcus as a victim rather than a villain. I don't want another child hurt. That's why I need this cub back, not for money, not for the circus, for safety. These animals need proper training, proper control, or they become killers. Whoever has this cub thinks they're helping, but they're creating a tragedy waiting to happen. A woman in the front row raised her hand. What will you do with the cub if you get it back? Train it properly, using proven methods to ensure it never poses a threat. The cub will live, will perform, but it will be under constant control. That's the only way to prevent what happened to Jeremy from happening to someone else's child. I felt sick listening to him. His pain was real, but it had twisted into something dark. He didn't want to train courage. He wanted to break him. A younger man sat beside Marcus, maybe 16, with the same strong features but softer eyes. This had to be Ethan, Marcus's surviving son. He stared at his hands while his father spoke, jaw tight with what looked like suppressed disagreement. "If anyone has information," Marcus continued, "please come forward. There's a reward, yes, but more importantly, you'll be keeping your community safe. Wild animals and humans don't mix. My son learned that the hard way. Don't let another family learn it, too." The meeting ended with applause. Grace and I slipped away into the darkness. Back at the cabin, Grace made a decision. She pulled out her phone and called a lawyer whose card William had left in his desk, Patricia Goldstein, specializing in property law and wildlife permits. Grace couldn't speak on the phone, but she'd learned to text. For an hour, she typed out the entire story, fingers flying across the screen. The lawyer's responses came back measured and careful. The legal situation was complicated. Grace could potentially get an exotic animal permit, but it would take 90 days minimum and require extensive safety measures. She'd need proof she could provide proper care, veterinary oversight, secure enclosures. And she'd need to prove she was a fit guardian for herself before she could be guardian for animals. The court date for her custody was in 2 weeks. If she lost everything. Grace set down the phone and looked at me. "I need you to trust me," she whispered. "Tomorrow, I'm going to do something risky, but it's the only way." I tilted my head, watching her. "I'm going to tell the truth, all of it, and whatever happens, happens." That night, I barely slept. I kept watch from the porch while Grace and the babies rested inside. The forest was quiet, but I felt the weight of coming disaster like a storm on the horizon. Somewhere out there, Marcus Thornwood was hunting, and we were running out of places to hide. The day it all fell apart started with sunshine and birdsong, nature's cruel joke before disaster. Grace woke early, more determined than I'd seen her since William died. She'd made a plan overnight, one she explained to me in whispers while preparing breakfast for Shadow and Courage. "I'm going to the deep forest," she said, mixing formula with steady hands. "There's a medicinal herb growing near the hollows that der Blackwood needs. She's been treating Shadow, for that ear infection. If I bring her the herbs, maybe she'll speak up for us at the custody hearing. Tell them I'm responsible." I didn't like it. The hollows were dangerous terrain, full of rocky outcrops and thick undergrowth. Black bears denned there, raising cubs this time of year. But Grace was desperate, and desperate creatures take risks. She commanded Shadow and Courage to stay at the cabin. They whined and protested, but Grace was firm. "I'll be back before lunch. Be good." I should have gone with her. That decision haunts me still. But I'd caught the scent of a deer nearby, and we needed meat. I calculated the distance, the time. I could make the kill, drag it back, and return before Grace even reached the hollows. Shadow and Courage would be safe at the cabin for an hour, maybe 2. I was wrong about everything. I brought down the deer cleanly, a quick kill the way William had taught me to respect prey. I was dragging it back through the forest, jaws aching from the weight, when the wind shifted. Blood, Grace's blood, the deer forgotten. I ran, faster than I'd ever run, branches tearing at my fur, lungs burning. The scent led me to the hollows, to a small clearing surrounded by ancient oaks. Grace lay crumpled at the base of a boulder, blood matting her blonde hair. Her eyes were closed, one arm bent at an unnatural angle. 10 feet away, a massive black bear stood on her hind legs, 2 cubs scrambling at her feet. I understood immediately what had happened. Grace had stumbled upon the bear family. The mother, seeing a threat to her cubs, had charged. Grace had run, the worst possible response, and fallen. Now she lay unconscious, and the bear was deciding if she was still a danger. Time slowed. I saw my choices with crystalline clarity. Run, save myself and my pup. Let nature take its course, or fight. I thought of William's hands freeing me from the trap. I thought of Grace's gentle voice reading to me at night. I thought of the drawing she'd made. Family isn't always blood. I charged. My war cry split the air, a sound wolves rarely make, reserved for the most desperate battles. The bear's head snapped toward me, surprised. She dropped to all fours, easily 500 pounds of muscle and fury to my 90 pounds of determination. I had no illusions about winning, but I didn't need to win. I just needed to drive her away from Grace. I went for the bear's legs, snapping at tendons, using speed against her size. She swiped at me, claws like knives, and I dodged, but not quite fast enough. Fire exploded across my shoulder as her claws raked deep, tearing through muscle to bone. The pain was blinding, but I couldn't stop. I bit harder, drew blood, darted away from her counterattacks. The bear roared, confused by this white wolf who refused to flee or submit. Then I heard them, Shadow and Courage, racing through the forest toward my distress call. They'd disobeyed Grace's command, following their instinct to protect pack. Shadow was still small, barely 20 pounds, but she threw herself into the fight with her mother's courage. Courage, now closer to 50 pounds and growing into his strength, added his voice to ours. His roar, still adolescent but deepening, echoed through the trees. It was the roar that changed everything. The bear's cubs panicked at the sound, scrambling up a tree. Their mother's attention shifted from offense to defense. She looked between us and her cubs, calculating 3 predators, including one that sounded like a lion, against her 2 vulnerable babies. She chose her cubs. The bear retreated, huffing warnings, positioning herself between us and the tree. She wouldn't leave, but she wouldn't attack again unless we pursued. I collapsed. Blood poured from my shoulder, painting the ground red. Shadow was at my side immediately, licking my wounds with desperate whimpers. Courage stood over Grace, guarding her body, still roaring warnings at the bear. Night fell, and we couldn't move. I was too weak from blood loss. Grace still unconscious. Shadow curled against my wounded side, her small body shaking. Courage lay across Grace's legs, sharing his warmth. The temperature dropped. Early June in the mountains could still freeze at night, and Grace was going into shock. I could smell it on her, the scent of her body shutting down. I dragged myself closer, ignoring the screaming agony in my shoulder. Shadow and I pressed against Grace's left side, Courage on her right. We formed a living blanket, our combined body heat the only thing standing between her and death. I kept my eyes open through the night, watching for threats. The bear had moved off, but hadn't left entirely. Coyotes circled at the edge of the clearing, drawn by the scent of blood. I growled whenever they came close, using the last of my strength to protect what mattered. Shadow stayed awake with me, her small body trembling but resolute. Courage fell asleep eventually, exhausted from fear and exertion, but his bulk provided crucial warmth. Sometime near dawn, I felt Grace stir. Her hand moved slightly. Fingers finding my fur. She didn't wake, but she held on, and I knew she was still fighting. "Stay alive," I whispered in the language of wolves, knowing she couldn't understand but hoping somehow she'd feel it. "William saved me. I'm saving you. We're even now, but don't you dare die on me." The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, beautiful and indifferent to the small drama of life and death playing out below. I heard voices in the distance, human voices calling Grace's name. I wanted to howl, to guide them to us, but I couldn't manage more than a weak whine. Shadow, understanding, lifted her head and howled. Her voice was high and young, but it carried through the morning air. The voices grew closer. Mrs. Chen appeared first, her elderly face pale with fear. She saw us and gasped, hand flying to her mouth. Behind her came Officer Hayes, Dr. Blackwood, and surprisingly, Ethan Thornwood. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene. 3 animals surrounding an unconscious girl. Blood everywhere. A bear still visible in the trees he owned. "Jesus Christ!" Hayes breathed. "They're protecting her." "Durr!" Blackwood started forward, but I growled, too weak to be threatening but unable to stop the reflex. She froze. "Ghost!" It was Ethan who spoke, using the name he must have heard from Grace's writings. His voice was gentle. "We're here to help. We're going to save her. But you need to let us close." I looked at Grace's pale face, looked at Shadow, exhausted and scared, looked at Courage, confused by all the humans. This was the moment William had prepared me for without knowing it. He'd taught me that not all humans were threats, that sometimes trust was the only path to survival. I nudged Shadow back, whined at Courage until he moved. Then I laid my head down in surrender, too weak to do anything else. Hayes spoke quickly into his radio, calling for medical evacuation. Blackwood rushed forward, checking Grace's vitals with practiced efficiency. "She's hypothermic, concussion, possible internal bleeding. But she's alive. If these animals hadn't kept her warm all night, she'd be dead." Blackwood's voice cracked with emotion. "This wolf is badly injured. I need to treat her too." "The wolf goes with the girl," Hayes said firmly. "I don't care what regulations say. That animal saved her life." A helicopter appeared over the trees, impossibly loud. Shadow pressed against me in terror. The humans worked quickly, loading Grace onto a stretcher. When they tried to leave me behind, Grace's eyes fluttered open. "Don't leave her." The words were slurred, barely audible, but unmistakable. Everyone froze. Did she just speak? Mrs. Chen whispered. Grace's hand reached out, groping blindly until she found my fur. "Ghost, come with me." Hayes made a decision. "Load the wolf, now." They carried me into the helicopter beside Grace. The noise was terrifying, the vibration unnatural, but Grace's hand stayed tangled in my fur, and that was enough. Shadow and Courage were left with Dr. Blackwood, who promised to care for them. I watched them grow smaller as we lifted into the sky. 2 small figures huddled together, already missing their family. In the helicopter, a medic tried to separate me from Grace to treat my wounds. Grace's grip tightened, her eyes opening briefly. "She stays," Grace whispered. Then her eyes closed again, and she didn't wake. I didn't know where we were going or what would happen next. I knew only that my shoulder was on fire, that I was weaker than I'd ever been, that Grace might die despite everything. But we were together, and somehow that mattered more than anything else. The helicopter banked, turning toward the city and the hospital that would decide if we lived or died. Below us, the Smoky Mountains stretched endless and green, indifferent to the small dramas of wolves and girls who loved them. I closed my eyes and prayed to whatever gods wolves believe in that I'd wake up again, that Grace would wake up again, that our story wouldn't end here, written in blood on forest floor, another tragedy in a world full of them. I woke in a cage, not a trap, but close enough. Steel bars surrounded me on all sides, cold and unyielding. The smells were overwhelming antiseptic. Blood, fear, other animals. I was in the veterinary section of the hospital, separated from Grace by walls I couldn't see through. My shoulder was wrapped in bandages, stitched and cleaned. An IV line ran into my leg, pumping fluids and antibiotics into my body. I tried to stand and immediately collapsed, my legs unable to support my weight. "Easy, girl." A veterinary technician approached the cage, her voice soothing. "You lost a lot of blood. You're lucky to be alive. Lucky." I didn't feel lucky. I felt trapped and desperate and utterly powerless. Through the walls, I could hear the muffled sounds of the human hospital. Beeping machines, urgent voices, the squeak of wheels on linoleum. Somewhere in that maze of corridors, Grace lay in a bed, and I couldn't reach her, couldn't protect her, couldn't even know if she was alive or dead. The not knowing was worse than the pain. Hours passed, days maybe. Time lost meaning in that cage. Veterinarians came and went, checking my wounds, adjusting medications. They spoke about me in clinical terms: severe lacerations, muscle damage, possible permanent mobility issues. They debated whether I could ever survive in the wild again. "If she can't hunt, she'll have to be placed in a sanctuary, one said. "Long-term captivity for a wild wolf, not ideal, but better than euthanasia." Euthanasia. They were discussing killing me as casually as humans discuss the weather. I thought of Shadow and Courage, taken to Dr. Blackwood's clinic. Were they eating? Were they terrified? Did they think I'd abandoned them on the third day? Officer Hayes visited. She stood outside my cage, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Grace is stable," she said quietly, as if she knew I needed to hear it. "Severe concussion, 2 cracked ribs, minor internal bleeding. But she's going to survive. The doctors say if you hadn't kept her warm, she would have died from hypothermia before we found her." Relief flooded through me so intensely, I whimpered. "The problem is what happens next." Hayes's voice dropped lower. "Aunt Margaret has filed emergency custody papers. She's arguing that Grace's injuries prove she can't care for herself, that living in the woods with wild animals is reckless endangerment. The hearing is in 2 days, and Grace is still too weak to attend." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Marcus Thornwood showed up at Dr. Blackwood's clinic yesterday with a court order. He took Courage. Blackwood tried to fight it, but he had the legal paperwork, ownership, bills of sale, everything. No, not Courage. Shadow is still with Dr. Blackwood. She's refusing to eat, just lies in the corner and howls. Hayes's voice cracked. That pup is dying of heartbreak. Ghost, she's given up. I threw myself against the cage bars, ignoring the agony in my shoulder. The technician rushed over, but Hayes waved her back. I can't let you out. I wish I could, but there are rules, liability issues. If you attacked someone, even accidentally, they'd put you down immediately. She pressed her hand against the bars. I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. After she left, I lay in my cage and felt despair settle over me like a heavy blanket. I'd failed everyone who mattered. Grace was going to lose her home. Courage was in the hands of a man who would torture him. Shadow was slowly dying of grief, and I was trapped, helpless. That night, I heard screaming from somewhere in the building. Not human screaming, animal screaming, the sound of something being hurt deliberately, methodically. I knew that voice, Courage. Marcus had brought him to this facility for veterinary assessment, but what he was doing wasn't medicine. It was torture, disguised as training. Food deprivation to break his spirit, loud noises at all hours to keep him disoriented, isolation to make him desperate for any interaction, even painful ones. I howled, threw myself against the cage again and again, reopening my wounds, blood seeping through bandages. Alarms sounded. Technicians came running, sedated me despite my struggles. As the drugs pulled me under, I heard Courage's cries growing weaker. I dreamed of William. He sat beside my cage, old and kind, looking at me with those understanding eyes. You did good, he said in my dream. You kept your promise. You protected her. I failed, I told him. She's losing everything. Not everything, son. She has her voice back. You gave her that. Sometimes the breaking open is what lets the healing begin. I woke to find myself restrained, straps holding me down to prevent further injury. A different veterinarian stood over me, this one older, with scars on his hands that spoke of a lifetime working with animals. You're fighting so hard, he said softly. Fighting to get to someone you love. I've seen this before, in dogs, in horses. The ones who have found their person. You're not just wild anymore, are you? You've chosen your pack. He made a note on his chart. Recommendation released to private sanctuary with established bond to minor Grace Sullivan. Animal demonstrates protective behavior consistent with domesticated guardian breeds while maintaining wild dignity. Separation causing psychological distress to both wolf and child. Medical recovery depended on reunion. It was the first piece of good news in days, but it meant nothing if Grace lost her custody hearing. If Margaret took her to Memphis, I'd never see her again. The sanctuary would become just another cage. That night, Aunt Margaret visited the hospital. I heard her voice through the walls, sharp with frustration and fear. Look at what happened to you. Grace, you nearly died. These animals are dangerous, uncontrollable. The court is going to see that. They have to. Grace's response was too quiet to hear, but I caught the emotion determination mixed with desperation. The hearing was tomorrow. Everything we'd built, everything we'd fought for, would be decided by strangers who'd never felt a wolf's heartbeat or seen a lion cub nurse beside a wolf pup. I'd face down a bear to save Grace. But I couldn't fight human law. All I could do was wait, trapped and bleeding, while the world decided our fate the morning of the hearing. everything changed. I was lying in my cage, weak and defeated, when Officer Hayes burst through the door with her phone in hand. Her face was flushed with excitement and anger mixed together. "Ghost, you need to see this." "Well, you can't actually see it, but I need to tell you." She crouched beside my cage. "Ethan Thornwood just uploaded a video to every social media platform and sent it to the news. He filmed his father, everything." She played the video, holding her phone to the bars so I could hear. Marcus Thornwood's voice came through, cold and methodical. "The whip teaches respect. Fear is the foundation of control. This cub must learn that resistance brings pain, submission brings relief. Then courage's screams, high-pitched and terrified, the sound of leather striking flesh." Marcus's calm instructions to someone else, probably Ethan, on how to properly break an animal's spirit. But there was more. Hayes scrolled through the video, her hand shaking. "The police found old records Marcus had hidden. The lion that killed his son, Jeremy, 12 years ago. It had been beaten for weeks before the incident. Veterinary reports Marcus suppressed showed multiple fractures, signs of starvation, infected wounds. The lion wasn't aggressive. It was defending itself from torture." She looked at me with fierce intensity. Jeremy's death wasn't the lion's fault. It was Marcus's. He'd been abusing that animal for months. And when Jeremy wandered into the restricted area that Marcus had left unsecured, the lion was already pushed beyond breaking. It lashed out at the first human it saw. Hayes stood, pacing. "Ethan found his father's hidden journals. Marcus knew it was his fault. He wrote about it, about his guilt, about how he couldn't face it. So he twisted the story in his mind, made himself the victim, made animals the villains. He's been taking his guilt out on every animal he's touched for 12 years. My heart was pounding. If this was true, if this was public. "It gets better," Hayes continued. "The video has gone viral. Animal welfare organizations are descending on Marcus's circus. The state has issued an emergency seizure order for all his animals, and a judge just issued a warrant for his arrest on multiple counts of animal cruelty." She knelt again, meeting my eyes through the bars. "Marcus Thornwood is done, and Courage is being transferred to a sanctuary within the hour." I felt something shift inside me. Not quite hope, but the possibility of hope. "The hearing is in 3 hours, Hayes said. "Grace is being discharged from the hospital against medical advice. She insisted she's going to fight for you, for Shadow, for her home. And now, with Marcus exposed, public opinion has completely flipped. The girl who risked her life with wild animals is suddenly the girl who was saved by them. You're not dangerous anymore in people's eyes. You're a hero." But I wasn't a hero. I was just a wolf who'd paid a debt to a kind man by protecting his granddaughter. That's all I'd ever been. The courtroom was a place I never thought I'd see. Officer Hayes convinced the judge to allow my presence via video feed, arguing that my behavior toward Grace was central to the case. A veterinary technician set up a laptop near my cage, angling it so I could see the proceedings. Grace sat at a table with her lawyer, Patricia Goldstein. She wore clean clothes someone had brought, her head bandaged, arm in a sling. She looked small and fragile, but her eyes were clear and determined. Aunt Margaret sat across the aisle with her lawyer, She didn't look cruel, just tired and worried. A woman who'd lost her brother, inherited a traumatized niece, and genuinely believed removing Grace from the woods was the right thing to do. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Susan Moreland, reviewed the case files with careful attention. This is an unusual situation. We have a 14-year-old girl who wishes to remain in an isolated cabin with exotic animals, against her aunt's wishes to provide a more traditional home environment. Margaret's lawyer stood. Your Honor, Grace Sullivan has suffered tremendous trauma. She stopped speaking for 10 years. She nearly died in the woods last week. Her attachment to these animals, while understandable, is clearly unhealthy. She needs professional care, socialization with peers, and proper supervision. Patricia Goldstein rose to respond. Your Honor, Grace has begun speaking again. Her selective mutism, caused by the trauma of losing her parents, has resolved. According to Dr. Ramon Martinez, the child psychologist who evaluated her, Grace's bond with these animals was actually therapeutic. It gave her a reason to communicate, to care for something beyond herself. The judge looked at Grace. Would you like to speak? Grace, you don't have to, but the court would like to hear from you if you're comfortable. Grace stood slowly. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, each word clearly practiced. I stopped talking when my parents died because words reminded me of the last thing my mom said, I love you, sweetheart. After she was gone, those words hurt too much to use. She paused, gathering strength. My grandfather understood. He taught me other ways to communicate, through drawing, through the forest, through taking care of things that needed me. When Grandpa died, I wanted to die too. The silence wasn't just in my voice anymore. It was everywhere. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice didn't waver. Then Ghost came back. She'd been Grandpa's friend, the wolf he'd saved years ago. She brought her pup and the lion cub to me. She trusted me with the things she loved most. Grace looked directly at the camera, knowing somehow I was watching. She fought a bear for me. She almost died keeping me warm. She gave everything because my grandfather once gave everything for her. That's not dangerous. That's love. The courtroom was silent. Even Margaret dabbed at her eyes. Grace continued, I know I'm young. I know it's unusual. But that cabin is my home. Those animals are my family. And I'm not broken anymore. I'm healing. Taking that away from me would break me again, and this time I don't think I'd come back. She sat down, exhausted from the effort of so many words. The judge called Dr. Martinez to testify. He explained Grace's remarkable progress, how her selective mutism had resolved through the responsibility and connection she felt with the animals. He testified that removing her from this environment could cause severe psychological regression. Then Dr. Blackwood testified about my behavior, about how I'd demonstrated clear protective instincts without aggression toward humans, about how Shadow was literally dying without her family, about how Courage had thrived under Grace's gentle care before being taken. Officer Hayes testified about finding us in the forest, about the clear evidence that we'd saved Grace's life, about how the real danger had been the bear, not the animals who loved Grace. Even Mrs. Chen testified, admitting she'd been feeding me for years, that I'd never once shown aggression, that Grace had been maintaining the property beautifully despite her age. Finally, the judge called for a recess. When she returned, her face was unreadable. "I've reviewed all testimony and evidence. This is indeed an unusual case." She looked at Margaret. "Ms. Sullivan Price, your concern for your niece is clear and comes from a place of love. But Grace is not a typical 14-year-old. She's been raised by a park ranger to understand wilderness survival, animal behavior, and self-sufficiency." The judge turned to Grace. "That said, you cannot live completely alone. The court is assigning a legal guardian who will check on you regularly, ensure you attend school, and provide oversight. Mrs. Dorothy Chen has volunteered for this role, and I'm appointing her as your temporary guardian until you turn 18. Grace's face lit up with hope. "As for the animals," Judge Moreland continued, "the court recognizes the unique bond that exists here. Grace Sullivan is granted a provisional exotic animal permit for the wolf and wolf pup, contingent on regular veterinary oversight and annual renewals. The lion cub, Courage, has been seized from Marcus Thornwood and will be placed in a licensed sanctuary. However, I'm authorizing that sanctuary to be established on Grace's property with proper enclosures and professional consultation." The judge's expression softened. "What you've built, Grace, is unusual, but unusual isn't wrong. You've demonstrated remarkable maturity and responsibility. Don't make me regret this decision." "I won't, Your Honor," Grace whispered. "Thank you." Margaret approached Grace after the hearing. They spoke quietly, and I saw Margaret embrace her niece, both of them crying. "I still think you're crazy," Margaret said, loud enough for the camera to catch. "But maybe that's okay. Your grandfather was crazy too, and he was the best man I ever knew." Grace smiled, her first real smile in months. "Will you visit?" "Every month. And if you need anything at all, you call me." The decision had been made. We'd won, but I was still in a cage, and our family was still scattered across the state. 3 months later, I stood on the porch of William's cabin and watched the autumn sun paint the Smoky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. My shoulder had healed, though I would always carry a slight limp. The veterinarians had been wrong about one thing: I could still hunt, not with the same speed and grace as before, but well enough. The scars were deep, but scars are just proof that you survived something that tried to kill you. Shadow emerged from the cabin behind me, nearly full-grown now at 6 months old. Her white fur gleamed in the afternoon light, and she moved with the confident grace of a wolf who'd never known rejection. She pressed against my side, and I licked her ear affectionately. "Mom," she seemed to say, in the language of our kind, "Courage is being silly again." I followed her gaze to the large enclosure we'd built at the forest's edge. It wasn't a cage, not really. 2 acres of natural habitat with trees for climbing, a small pond, rocky outcrops for sunbathing, and a shelter for when weather turned harsh. The gates stood open during the day, allowing Courage to roam the property freely, but providing security at night. Courage had grown enormous in 3 months. He was nearly 100 pounds now, his mane just beginning to develop in a golden ruff around his face. He was chasing a butterfly with the same enthusiasm he'd shown as a cub, pouncing and missing, tumbling over his own massive pause. Grace sat nearby on a fallen log, sketchbook in her lap, laughing at his antics. The sound of her laughter still surprised me sometimes. For so long she'd been silent. Now she filled the air with words, with music, with joy. She'd started high school online in September, and her teachers marveled at her intelligence. Years of reading Williams' books had given her an education most teenagers never received. She wrote essays about ecology and animal behavior that her biology teacher shared with colleagues. She spoke at town council meetings about conservation, her voice strong and clear. The girl who couldn't speak had found her voice by learning to listen. Mrs. Chen visited every morning, bringing groceries and checking in. She'd taken her guardian role seriously, but with the perfect balance of oversight and freedom, she understood that Grace needed space to be herself, to live the life William had prepared her for. "How are my babies today?" Mrs. Chen called as she made her way up the path, arms full of grocery bags. "Shadow caught her first rabbit this morning," Grace announced proudly, "all by herself." "That's my girl, Mrs." Chen beamed at Shadow, who wagged her tail with pleasure. I had grown to appreciate Mrs. Chen in ways I never expected. She wasn't trying to change us or tame us. She was simply ensuring we had what we needed to thrive. She'd helped Grace navigate the bureaucracy of permits and inspections. She'd organized fundraisers that brought in enough money to build proper facilities. She'd become the grandmother Grace had never had. The sanctuary, officially named Will's Promise Wildlife Education Center, had become something beyond what we'd imagined. School groups visited twice a week to learn about wildlife conservation. Grace gave tours, explaining animal behavior, answering questions, showing visitors that wild animals deserved respect, not fear. Courage was the star of these visits. He'd lounge in his enclosure, regal and calm, while children pressed against the fence to take pictures. He'd never shown aggression, never given anyone reason to fear him. He was living proof that animals raised with love instead of violence could be gentle. But he was still wild at heart. I saw it in the way he watched the forest, in how his eyes tracked birds overhead. He belonged to Grace, yes, but he also belonged to himself. That was the difference between our sanctuary and Marcus's circus. We didn't own these animals. We shared space with them. Marcus Thornwood was in prison, serving 5 years for animal cruelty. The evidence Ethan had provided, combined with testimony from former circus employees, had been overwhelming. His circus had been shut down, the animals distributed to proper sanctuaries across the country. Ethan visited us once a month. He was 17 now, working toward a degree in veterinary medicine, trying to atone for his father's sins. He and Grace had become friends, bonded by their understanding of how trauma could twist people into monsters or break them open into something better. "Dad writes me letters," Ethan had told Grace during his past visit. "He's in therapy, says he's finally facing what he did, what he caused. He asked me to tell you and encourage he's sorry, for whatever that's worth." Grace had considered this carefully. Hurt people, but healing people can heal people too. Maybe someday he'll do more good than harm. I didn't forgive Marcus. Wolves don't forgive, not the way humans do. But I understood that he'd been broken by grief, that his son's death had shattered something inside him that never healed right. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained it. As the sun began to set, Grace called us all together. It was our evening ritual, something she'd started in the first week after we'd all come home. Shadow and I settled on either side of her. Courage lumbered over from his enclosure and lay at her feet, his massive head resting on her legs. Mrs. Chen sat in the rocking chair William had built decades ago, knitting something soft and warm. Grace pulled out William's old journal, the one he'd kept for 40 years. She'd been reading it to us, one entry each evening, learning about her grandfather through his own words. October 5th, 20 years ago, Grace read. Found a young doe caught in barbed wire today, Frida. But she'd been there for days, infected wounds. Probably won't survive, but I'll try. That's all we can do in this world, try, even when it seems hopeless. She turned the page. October 2nd, the doe survived. Released her this morning. She looked back at me before running off, and I swear I saw gratitude in her eyes. Maybe I'm anthropomorphizing. Maybe I'm just a sentimental old fool, but I don't think so. I think animals remember kindness the same way they remember cruelty. We owe them our best selves. Grace's voice caught, and she closed the journal. He was right. You remember, don't you, Ghost? You remembered what Grandpa did for you, and you did the same for me. I pressed my head against her hand, and she buried her fingers in my fur. I've been thinking about something, Grace said quietly, about cycles, about how pain can create more pain, or how it can create compassion. Marcus's son died, and he chose to make the world hurt the way he hurt. But Grandpa lost his wife, and he chose to save things, to help, to heal. She looked at each of us in turn. We get to choose which cycle we're part of. Every day we choose. The autumn air turned cooler as night fell. We moved inside, into the cabin that smelled like wood smoke and home. Grace made dinner while Shadow and I curled by the fireplace. Courage remained outside, preferring the cool air, but I could see him through the window, watching over our small kingdom. Later, after Mrs. Chen had gone home and Grace had fallen asleep with a book on her chest, I slipped outside. Shadow followed, as she always did. We walked to William's grave under the old oak tree. Grace had planted wildflowers around the headstone, and they swayed in the night breeze. I sat before the grave, and Shadow sat beside me. I kept my promise, I told him in the language of my kind. Your granddaughter is safe. She's happy. She's becoming someone you would be proud of. The wind rustled through the trees, and I chose to believe it was his answer. Shadow nudged my shoulder, the one with the scars. Does it still hurt? Sometimes, but that's okay. Some pain is worth carrying. We sat together in comfortable silence, mother and daughter, watching the stars emerge one by one above the mountains. I thought about my life, about the strange path that had led me here, born cursed, rejected by my pack, saved by a kind human, living now in a space between wild and tame that had no name. I wasn't domesticated, but I'd chosen to stay. There was a difference, though humans rarely understood it. Grace needed me, Shadow needed me, and maybe, after years of running and hiding and surviving alone, I needed them too. A wolf howl echoed from the distant mountains. My old pack, or what remained of it. Once, that sound would have called to me, would have made me yearn for the wild. Now, it was just a sound. Beautiful, but belonging to a life I'd left behind. Shadow tilted her head, listening. Do you ever want to go back to be fully wild again? I considered the question. I am wild. I'll always be wild. But wild doesn't mean alone anymore. It means choosing your pack, and I've chosen mine. We returned to the cabin. Grace had woken and moved to her bed, leaving the door open for us. Shadow curled at the foot of the bed. I took my place beside Grace, feeling her hand rest on my head as she drifted back to sleep. Through the window, I could see Courage in his enclosure, peaceful and safe. This was my life now, not the life I'd imagined as a pup before everything went wrong, but maybe a better one. I'd learned something William had known all along. Love is a choice you make every day, to protect, to nurture, to stay when leaving would be easier. I closed my eyes, listening to Grace's steady breathing, Shadow's soft snores, the night sounds of the forest beyond our walls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight we were all home, and that was enough. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance. They're about loyalty that transcends species, about debts repaid across years, about choosing to stay when you could run. Ghost's journey reminds us that family isn't always defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up when you're trapped and broken, who keeps you warm through the coldest nights, who fights bears they can't possibly defeat. Because your life matters more than their own. We spend so much of our lives building walls, protecting ourselves from loss and pain. But Grace and Ghost teach us something profound. The walls that keep out hurt also keep out love. True connection requires vulnerability. It requires trusting again after betrayal, opening your heart after it's been shattered, believing in goodness when the world has shown you cruelty. William understood this when he freed that trapped wolf. Grace understood it when she let wild animals into her home and heart. And Ghost understood it when she chose love over freedom, family over survival. The question isn't whether we'll face loss and pain. We will. The question is whether we'll let those experiences close us off or crack us open to deeper compassion. What moments in your life taught you that love is worth the risk? Have you ever experienced loyalty that changed everything? Share your story in the comments below.